Okay, this is the second part for our lecture 9, and in this part we're going to actually talk about the organization of long-term memory. So it really starts with when you think about long-term memory and everything that it does. Let me just read you a quote from Endel Tolving, who said that general memory encompasses huge domains: classical and operant conditioning, detection of stimuli, localization of stimuli, concept formation, language learning, etc. So this is really challenging to understand. We could spend a lot of time talking about the various organization of long-term memory and everything that it does. Instead, what I'm going to do in this class is we'll focus on a basic taxonomy. This is a taxonomy that there's lots of consensus, lots of evidence, and pretty much everybody accepts these distinctions in memory. So we're going to go through these basic fundamental distinctions. And the first one is this difference between explicit memory and implicit memory. And now, terminology is going to be difficult here, so I encourage you to make a little glossary as you're going through this to keep track of these definitions. Practice your definitions till you get them well rehearsed. And the other thing to keep in mind is that explicit sometimes goes by different names. Like sometimes it's called declarative memory, declarative memory or explicit memory. Those are the same sorts of things. So you remember this from the HM video. That's what they called it. Now, implicit memory sometimes is called non-declarative. Sometimes it's called procedural. These are all functionally referring to the same sorts of concepts, right? But we're going to talk about it as explicit versus implicit. And so let's start with some of the definitions of this. So explicit, as you can see here, it's also called declarative. It's conscious memory for facts or information. So if I were to sort of ask you, what is memory? Chances are you're going to describe things that fall into explicit memory. So these are things that you've learned throughout your life. And we can test explicit memory by asking you to complete either a recognition test. Is this something old or new? Have you encountered this before? Or ask you to recall information. And we'll have some examples of that a little bit later in terms of this. But implicit memory, procedural memory, this is a little bit more difficult to define and observe, but it's information retained in memory without specific learning. So sometimes it's referred to as an unconscious memory system, and it includes memory for skill. So often skill learning is given as an example of implicit memory. You're reading Moonwalking with Einstein, and he talks about driving a car, riding a bike, or even the mirror tracing task that patient HM does could be considered a form of implicit memory. So testing implicit memory is a little bit more challenging. So I'm going to give you some examples of how we can test it implicit memory. So typically, people would come to the laboratory and they would read a list of words, for example, and they would be told, hey, we want you to complete this task. And usually it's described as a completely different or unrelated task. So sometimes this gets referred to as an indirect test. So it's not a direct test of memory like you would have for explicit memory, saying, study these words, now we're going to test your memory for these words. Instead, it's an indirect test, right? So imagine that the experimental group reads some different words than the control group, like 10 different words. And imagine that we then ask people to complete, for example, these stems. So these stems, SH, there's lots of words in the English language that you can complete it to fill in the stem here, to complete it with a English word. But imagine that if you, in this list of words, read the word sheet, well, you'd be much more likely to write in sheet here. Now, you can ask people, did you intentionally use words from the first task, first part of the experiment? And they'll say, no, I didn't do that. But yet, probabilistically, they will complete these stems with words that they were recently encountered, right? So this word stem completion is a way to sort of test implicit memory. Another example is to give them a word fragment. So this is where you have a word and blanks exist where letters should be. Now this fragment is really hard to complete unless you've seen the word toboggan recently. Then you would be able to fill in this fragment pretty quickly. Another way to test implicit memory is to have people engage what's called a lexical decision task. This is where they're just deciding, they're seeing words pass by on a screen and they're just deciding, is it a word or a non-word? So they would press one key for a word, press a different key for a non-word, and you can measure the response time. So, for example, they'll respond faster to words that were recently encountered. Like if they saw the word sheet on that original phase, they'll be faster to that than even other words like shoot. But they'll be faster to new words relative to non-words. So we identify words much faster than non-words, hence the lexical decision task. But you can get this measure of faster response time to words that you've seen recently. This is something that's often referred to as priming, because if you see this word earlier in the experimental phase, you're going to be much faster to respond to it, hence the name priming. To give you another example of priming, in one of the studies that I did with Heather Brewitt, we showed people pictures, and it's going to clear up here in just a second. We showed people pictures of products like, for example, you'd see Dr. Pepper, and then we would show them a picture of Dr. Skipper. And what they were asked to do here is just indicate whether it was a name brand product or an off-brand product, and we measured the response time. And those that were primed, where they were preceded by a name brand product, which was very similar, the response time was much faster, by 100 milliseconds or so. So again, showing faster response times is a measure of sort of implicit memory in this particular situation. So let's talk about evidence that there's a difference between these two memories. One piece of evidence comes from sort of cognitive behavioral measures, right? And Tolving, Schachter, and Stark, what they did is they had people study a list of 96 words. In the phase 2, which took place 1 hour later, they completed a recognition study. So remember, recognition is you see a list of old and new words, you identify which words you studied. So this would be a test of explicit memory. Or they did that word fragment completion. So they just completed words with any word that would complete the fragment. Turns out a lot of them were based off of the list of 96 words, right? So they measured their performance 1 hour later, and then they measured their performance 7 days later on the same thing, recognition or word fragment completion. And so let's look at their evidence here. So within an hour, recognition is a little bit better than word fragment completion. But look what happens 7 days later. So fragment completion stays pretty stable here, right? But recognition drops down 7 days later. That is, you don't really remember what words you saw 7 days later in the laboratory, but this word fragment completion stays pretty stable. So these different forgetting rates are evidence that we have two different kinds of memory, right? If they were both the same kind of memory, why wouldn't the forgetting rate be the same? But different forgetting rates shows a dissociation or provides some evidence that they're different forms of memory. Now, another piece of evidence comes from patient HM, neuropsych evidence, right? So remember when we talked about HM before, when we talked about patient HM before, he had impaired explicit memory, right? So he couldn't form any new explicit long-term memories. However, his skills could improve, right? So he improved on the mirror tracing test, or he improved on the Tower of Hanoi test. And so that shows you that he had intact implicit memory. So he's able to form new implicit memories, even though his explicit memory system was damaged, right? So this was pretty clear evidence that for this distinction between implicit and explicit memory. Now, another distinction that we can draw here is, so we've talked about the difference between explicit and implicit memory, right? And we just reviewed some evidence for it. But another distinction that we can make is if we are now talking about explicit memory, so we're breaking down explicit memory into two forms, episodic and semantic. So episodic memory is the memory for the autobiographical episodes and, importantly, the temporal relationship between the events. Now, prototypically, like if you're testing recognition in an experiment, or really most any kind of memory within a laboratory phenomena, it's going to fall into this episodic domain. Now, semantic memory, though, on the other hand, is crystallized memory for facts or information. It includes knowledge or words that are used in language, right? And it's devoid of any of these spatio-temporal details that characterize episodic memory, right? So some examples of semantic memory, like general knowledge questions. So think like Jeopardy, You hear like Jeopardy questions. Who's the president of the College of New Jersey? Or the meaning of words, like what's an armadillo? These would be semantic memories, right? It's possible you've had an episodic memory if you've ever come across an armadillo or had one as a pet. Maybe you have some episodic memories, but chances are slim. Most likely you just sort of have this semantic memory of it. Now, some of the evidence for distinguishing between episodic and semantic memory, we're going to talk about two pieces of evidence. First, some cognitive behavioral evidence. So just Jacoby and Dallas in this study, what they did is they had 3 encoding conditions, and they encoded words either using structural, phonetic, or semantic. Now, this should look familiar to you. This is straight out of levels of processing, right, and straight out of encoding. You should know that these depth of processing is going to promote different, stronger memories, right? So the deeper you process it, the stronger the memory will be. So semantic should result in better episodic memories, right? Phonetic, structural, less so, right? So what they did is they had people do 2 tests. One was a recognition test where you sort of identify the old words. And again, we're predicting that the deeper you process it, the better your recognition memory. But they also did this thing called a semantic identification test. Essentially what they did is they presented the words very quickly, just at the sort of the threshold level. And all they were asked to do is identify what the word was. So basically just read the word, right? So this semantic identification test presumably just taps into semantic memory. So what they found is, let's look at, so this is the encoding, so structural, phonetic, and semantic. And let's look at recognition first. So recognition for structurals, low, goes up a little bit for phonetic, and goes even higher for semantic. So you see that same levels of processing effect that we would expect to see for recognition. But let's look at the identification task, which, remember, this presumably taps into semantic memory. And you notice this is just knowledge for words. It doesn't change much. The numbers go up a little bit, but they're not statistically significant. This is flat again. So again, what we're seeing, kind of like the Tolving, Schachter, and Stark, but the opposite direction, levels of processing increases the memories for one form of memory, but doesn't alter the other one, right? So it is evidence that episodic memory is affected by levels of processing during encoding, but semantic memories are not. Now let's talk about another piece of evidence, so some neuropsych evidence. So Warrington and Weiskrantz, what they did is they had some patients who had hippocampal damage, and they were amnesic, and they were tested in recognition. Now remember, recognition, it's just an episodic memory test. But they also did a STEM completion test. Now this can get confusing because we talked about STEM completion being used to measure implicit memory, but here there's no study phase. So it's just a test of language. Fill these stems in with any English word, and you're not looking for measures of implicit memory per se. So on the semantic test, the amnesics were equivalent to the controls, right? So their knowledge of language of memory was equivalent, but on recognition, they struggled. They were kind of like patient HM. They performed more poorly than controls on recognition. So that shows you a dissociation there. Now, subsequent studies have shown the opposite dissociation, which you really kind of need in order to have good evidence here, and that is the patients with damage to the left inferior frontal lobe have intact recognition, so their episodic memory is intact, but impaired semantic memory, right? So they struggle with filling in word stems, for example. So do you remember the Nelson Cowan's test of his working memory, where it linked left inferior frontal lobes to semantic memory? That's a connection that you sort of see here. Now we're talking about these different kinds of information, in particular episodic and semantic memory, and they are dissociable. We can get evidence that separates them, but I want to bring that back together because sometimes people think because they're separate they don't work together, but they do work together. A couple of examples of this. Priming, which is implicit memory, can increase accuracy on recognition tests, which is a test of explicit memory. So it is possible for these two forms of memory, although they're dissociable, they can interact or they can work together. Another example, semantic memory can aid episodic memory judgments of source. So source monitoring, we're going to dive into this in a lecture or two, but essentially if you're asked who said it, did the male voice say it or did the female voice say it, that's a judgment of source, right? And what we did in this particular study is we had the male voice say stereotypically consistent masculine things, or we had the female voice say stereotypically feminine things, in one condition. And in another condition, they said a mix of them. So the male voice said both masculine and feminine things, and the female voice said both masculine and feminine words. And so if you look at the performance here, so this is just their performance on the source test. So male items that were called male, female, or so items that were spoken by the female voice that were called female, etc. And you can see that when they were stereotypically consistent, they were much better. So performance was much greater than when they were stereotypically inconsistent. So what was going on here is people were able to use their knowledge of stereotypes for what is masculine, what is feminine, to make an educated guess as to who said the actual information. So this is another example of where semantic memory, in some cases, your knowledge about what's masculine, what's feminine, can actually aid your memory judgments for some sort of episodic information. So one last little bit here, we're going to move into a form of episodic memory. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about recognition a little bit more in detail. So this is our taxonomy here. We've talked about in this video the difference between explicit and implicit, and then we broke down explicit memory into episodic and semantic. So in our next lecture, we're going to talk about recognition. Now, recognition is when you study some information and you're presented with information and you have to pick out what was old or encountered from what was new. So in our next lecture, that's exactly what we're going to focus on.